Coming up on this week's GCN Racing News Show, we will take a look back at yet another extremely exciting week of racing at the Tour de France. Does Primož Roglič have it in the bag? Not yet, according to me. I'll also go through all the main action of Tirreno Adriatico, which finishes later today, and analyse Annemiek van Vleuten cyclocross skills at the Giro Rosa. We shall start though with the biggest race of them all, the Tour de France. As the second week has drawn to a close, we now have a fairly clear hierarchy on the general classification. Primož Roglič might not have a complete stranglehold on the race, but his team, Jumbo-Visma, certainly seemed to. The way they rode yesterday to La Grande Colombière was as dominant as any performance we've seen from Sky or Ineos. They had 6 of their 8 men still in the front group as they hit that final climb, and by the time Wout van Aert had peeled off, the likes of Nairo Quintana had already been dropped. Also dropped, and conceding over 7 minutes, was Egan Bernal. Last year's winner had a horrific day in the saddle, and his title defence appears now to be completely over. And it's the first time since 2010 that we've seen that team look incapable of winning the race. In the years that they haven't won the Tour de France since 2010, they have had riders who looked in the form to go for the win. So Bradley Wiggins crashed out of the 2011 race, and then Chris Froome the same in 2013. Now, it may be that Bernal is ill because as I record this, there's been no comment from the team. But even if that is the case, they certainly haven't been the team that we are used to seeing at the Tour de France. And that has raised questions in itself. In fact, here was what Bradley Wiggins had to say about the matter on the breakaway yesterday evening.
I think, his fall from the GC in this race has been quite rapid over the last couple of days. And even yesterday, he had a go in the final, didn't he? But he may be struggling with something, and that may come out in the next couple of days. So I think they'll all be pleased with a rest day tomorrow. This race isn't over really for a lot of guys.
It's certainly a team that's gone through some major changes recently, and you've got to say it's their most inexperienced Tour de France squad for many years. Egan Bernal, for example, despite winning last year, is only competing at his 3rd Tour de France. And they're all missing Nico Portal, who of course sadly passed away in March. It's certainly an unusual position for them to be in, that's for sure. Taking over their mantle though are Jumbo-Visma, who haven't really put a foot wrong for the entire 2 weeks of the race so far. The thorn in their side though could be Tadej Pogačar of UAE Team Emirates. Now I've said it on Twitter, but I'm going to say it again here now. I love Pogačar, or at least the way that he races. He's 21 years of age with a ridiculous amount of talent. But what I like most is the fact that he just throws it all out there and actually goes on the attack. Now, had it not been for the time that he lost in the crosswinds after a mechanical problem in that first week, he'd be leading this race, even if he hadn't sailed away over the Col du Peyresourde. Now, of course, Jumbo-Visma and Roglič would probably have raced differently if he hadn't lost that time in the crosswinds, but nevertheless, you'd imagine that he is the man they are most nervous about. And with very good reason, because he beat Primož Roglič at the Slovenian National Time Trial Championships a few weeks ago at the end of July, and so Roglič can't rely on that penultimate time trial stage of the Tour de France going in his favour. Anyway, I would like to know what you think. Will Tadej Pogačar win this year's Tour de France? Yes or no? There's a link to a poll on the GCN app that you'll see on your screen right now. And of course, as ever, you can also get involved in the comment section just below this video. Now, the one thing that Tadej doesn't have, though, is a strong team. But then he doesn't really seem to need one because Jumbo-Visma do most of the work for him, or at least for Roglič. We shall see, but I'm certainly very excited to watch the final week of the race this year. Now, the other mouth-watering prospect over the next few days is going to be the fight for the green jersey. So this year, Peter Sagan is not having it all his own way. Far from it, in fact, because he trails Sam Bennett of the Koenig Quick-Step by 45 points. 43 of those, though, were lost after he was relegated for this incident at the end of stage 11. Sagan there using his head and body to make space between Van Aert and the barriers, a move which the UCI commissars deemed to be against the rules. Now, as ever with Sagan, it did stir a lot of debate as to whether that was the correct decision or not. Brian Smith was adamant that it was the right decision, whilst other ex-pros bemoaned the fact that sprinting isn't what it used to be. Graham Brown, the Australian former Rabobank rider, even going as far to say that the UCI are ruining sprinting. Either way, it has meant that Peter Sagan and Bora Hansgrohe have come out fighting in the following stages, and you can put your house on the fact that they won't give up until the race finally reaches Paris on Sunday. Now, the week itself had begun with the two flattest stages of the race, and so as expected, both of those did end up in bunt sprints. With such limited opportunities remaining for the sprinters in this year's race, there was no way they were going to let either of those two stages get away from them. So we'll start with stage 10 from Ile de Léron to the Ile de Ré. That one was won by Sam Bennett himself. Now, he'd been knocking on the door of a Tour stage win for quite some time, and having finally landed the victory that he craved, he gave one of the most endearing interviews I think I've ever seen.
Been waiting for this such a long time.
Yeah. I just want to thank everyone that's been involved. Just want to thank the whole team and Patrick for giving me this opportunity, and just everybody he took to get to here. And I want to thank my wife and everyone around me. Sorry.
It's just so great to see someone wear their heart on their sleeve, isn't it? And that was a fantastic interview. And believe it or not, even the great Sean Kelly actually did have a tear in his eye at the end of that stage. Bennett becomes then the second Irish rider to win a stage of all three Grand Tours. But the surprising thing is that the other person wasn't Sean Kelly or Stephen Roach, but actually Shea Elliott back in the early 1960s. Bennett is also now the 99th rider to have achieved that particular feat of winning a stage in all three Grand Tours. So, something for the cycling stat nerds to look forward to there. Who will be the 100th? The following day, Bennett was going for two in a row, and with a stage finished in Poitiers, the scene of fellow Carrick-on-Sur man Sean Kelly's first ever Tour de France stage win back in 1978, it would have been quite the story. However, Caleb Ewan hadn't read the script, and it was the Australian who came out on top that time, that being the stage where Sagan was relegated, of course. Now, we also learned over the last 7 days that barring a miracle, there will, yet again, be no French winner of the Tour de France, and that will be for the 35th year in a row. So after Thibaut Pinot's capitulation last week, the nation's hopes switched to Guillaume Martin and Romain Bardet. Until Friday's stage 13 to Le Puy-Marie, they were sitting quite nicely in 3rd and 4th place respectively, both within 30 seconds of the overall lead. But both riders were dropped as the leaders approached the top of the penultimate climb of the Col de Néron. Martin admitted afterwards that he'd wasted too much energy in trying to chase back on before the final climb, and that had cost him dearly. He ended up losing nearly 3 minutes to Roglič and Pogačar, and with that, any serious hopes he had of finishing on the final podium come Paris. Romain Bardet's excuse, on the other hand, was a much more obvious one. So long before that final climb, and with 90 k's to go in fact, he was involved in what looked like a relatively innocuous crash. But then the footage of the aftermath showed Bardet sitting on the ground, seemingly gathering himself, but then he tried to rise to his feet and then stumbled immediately back down onto the tarmac. And it certainly looked at the time, even to my untrained eye, that these were the actions of a rider who just suffered a concussion. And indeed, Bardet abandoned the Tour later that evening as a result of a concussion, which was revealed by a brain scan in a local hospital. But he hadn't abandoned before riding the remaining 90 kilometres to the finish of that stage, which begs the question, should he have been allowed back on his bike? With the benefit of hindsight, and from the privileged position of being able to watch several replays of the incident at the time, of course the answer is absolutely not. He should have been taken away, really, in an ambulance and not let anywhere near his bike or the race or the other riders still within the race. But I must admit, I do have a degree of sympathy for both Romain Bardet himself and also his team AG2R. In the heat of the moment, a decision like that is not as obvious nor as easy to take. It's a completely normal reaction when anyone gets knocked off their bike to want to immediately dust themselves off and get straight back on it. And that doesn't just go for professional bike riders at the Tour de France, it also goes for a commuter who might have got doored on the way to work. I'm pretty sure all of you have had some sort of incident on a bike yourselves where you crashed, and when you get knocked down, there's a certain level of embarrassment to it, no matter whose fault the crash was. Then the adrenaline kicks in, starts to pump, and you really do just want to get back on your bike and get on with your ride and away from that particular situation. And for a Tour de France rider, especially one who is trying to win the race overall, There is also the rapidly unfolding horror in front of their eyes almost, that your rivals are flying up the road without you. So the need to immediately remount and continue in the race can be even more overwhelming. The team and the sports directors are put in quite a difficult situation really, where the medically correct thing to do is to take the rider out of the race. But there can be other pressures at play as well. So for a cycling team, it's not an exaggeration to suggest that in some situations, the entire future of the team can depend on the success of a specific rider on that team. And with something as intangible as concussion, in the heat of the moment when the injury is not staring you in the face as it would be if somebody had a broken bone, I can understand why a team would make a hasty decision to wait and see and take that approach. As it might turn out, the rider could be fine and they've just removed their star rider from the Tour when actually they didn't really need to. But it's just so difficult with a sport like cycling because it's not like football or rugby where a player can be taken out of the game, assessed on the sidelines, pass whatever concussion protocol is in place and then be reintroduced to the game. If you take a timeout from the Tour de France, your race could be over for good. There are concussion protocols in the UCI rules and regulations, but they do appear to fall woefully short of being fit for purpose and not really in any way tailored to the complexities which are specific to professional bike racing. Now, I'm sure that this is not the last that we'll hear on this topic. Just before we finish with the Tour de France for this week though, our team of the week for me has to be Sunweb. They came so close on so many occasions to taking a stage win on the opening week, but in the second week, they've nabbed themselves two. And I don't think anybody was more deserving than Mark Hirschi of coming away from this race with a stage win. The way he rides is a breath of fresh air, as I was saying last week. Søren Kragh Andersen took the other one on Saturday, and they just seem to have nailed their tactics at the moment, haven't they? Right, we shall move on now to Italy and to the Giro Rosa to start with. The biggest stage race on the Women's World Tour calendar got underway on Friday with a 16.8 kilometre team time trial in Grosseto in Tuscany. It's actually the only team time trial on the entire women's calendar this year, and it was won by Trek Segafredo. They finished 3 seconds ahead of Bulls Dulmans and a further 2 seconds ahead of the Australian squad Mitchelton Scott. And the win put Aliso Longo Borghini into the pink jersey. And she was the first Italian to lead that race since 5-time champion Fabiana Luperini last won it overall in 2008. The lead swapped hands the following day though, and you can probably guess to whom, even if you haven't seen the results. Annemiek van Vleuten sailed to a solo victory on stage 2. Well, I say sailed, but it certainly wasn't all plain sailing. I loved this tweet from the world champion after the stage. She said, "I thought I was running up that gravel climb at the time, but looking back at the footage, it appears as though I was walking." Great stuff. It was Marianne Vos, the boss, who won the hilltop finish on stage 3 on Sunday. But Van Vleuten now holds a healthy 1 minute and 22 second advantage over Anna van der Breggen going into stage 4. Don't forget, actually, that we've got daily long-form highlights of that race for you over on Race Pass. We'll get them up for you just as soon as we can once we've sent them from the host broadcasters each day. They're available in all Race Pass territories except for New Zealand, Australia and Italy. We'll head back to men's racing now, and we've been treated to the unusual spectacle of Tirreno Adriatico taking place during the Tour de France. It's been neatly slotted in though, so that the first and final stages coincide with the Tour de France's 2 rest days. This year's race consists of 8 stages rather than the usual 7, and it got underway, as it has done for the past 6 years now, in Lido di Camaiore. Whilst Caleb Ewan and Sam Bennett have been going toe-to-toe at the Tour de France, the sprinting field at Tirreno Adriatico isn't that bad either, with Pascal Ackermann and Fernando Gaviria emerging as the 2 fastest. But it was the German who took the honours on both of those opening 2 stages, the first of which came after an incredible sprint where Ackermann moved up on the outside of Gaviria when it looked like there was absolutely no room to do so. In the end, he just pipped the Colombian to the line, but it was really quite spectacular. For the next few days after that, the race became a battle of the general classification riders that are over in Italy. Those present, unsurprisingly, are also who we'd expect to see challenging for the Giro d'Italia when that gets underway in just a couple of weeks' time. The opening blow was dealt by the Canadian Mike Woods of EF Pro Cycling, and if you would like to hear from Woods himself, don't forget to check out the weekly World of Cycling show, which is available as part of GCN's Race Pass, where Woods is one of our featured fan club riders. The next episode of the World of Cycling will be available on Wednesday evening. And it will be Si on the couch with Brian Smith, the former national champion, alongside him. It has been Alpecin Fenix though who've lit up the last 2 stages. Tim Merlier, the Belgian road champion and cyclocross star, outsprinted everyone on stage 5, despite appearing to spend more time looking behind himself than at the finish line in front of him. And then the following day, we saw the first masterclass from Mathieu van der Poel in quite some time. So he'd been in the breakaway for most of the day and managed yet again to turn around a situation in which it looked like all hopes of the stage win had vanished, only to fight back in incredible style at the very last. That race concludes today with a 10-kilometre individual time trial where Simon Yates of Mitchelton Scott will attempt to defend his lead over Rafael Majka and Geraint Thomas. Right, just before we finish for this week, a couple of bits of transfer news. Firstly, Jasper Philipsen, the young Belgian sprinter, will be joining Alpecin Fenix next year. He'll be moving over from UAE Team Emirates, where he's been for the last couple of years. And they themselves have announced a new signing too, in the form of Matteo Trentin. So the Italian is yet another rider to be moving on from the CCC team, whose future is looking increasingly uncertain, unfortunately. Right, that is all for this week's GCN Racing News Show. I'll be back next week to talk through the conclusion of the Tour de France, by which point we will of course have the answer to our question as to whether Tadej Pogačar can win the race. Don't forget, you can also join me with Bradley Wiggins on the breakaway after each stage. That's over on Race Pass. That will resume on Tuesday, so I hope that we will have your company then. In the meantime, I'm off for another rest. Goodbye.